You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. Please share us with your friends.
At Crop King Seeds, we sell the finest marijuana seeds in the world. Grown organically with original genetics, every seed is cultivated for large yields, high THC content, and measured for both CBD and CBN levels. Did we mention we sell more than 20 of the world's best marijuana strains in feminized, auto-flowering, medical, and regular varieties, including White Widow, Blueberry, Purple Kush, Haze Extreme, and so many more. Through our website and friendly call support team, our seeds are available for direct order with speedy worldwide shipping. Crop King Seeds are also sold in over 100 locations worldwide.
Excuse me, I'm looking to buy some Crop King seeds.
Look no further, my friend.
Wow, they're here and in so many strains.
Buy your seeds now, in-store or online at CropKingSeeds.com. Or call us toll-free at 1-844-CROP-KING. That's 1-844-276-7546.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spend. Take another look now and take some time for hemp. I know cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. Oh, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rest. Well, right now it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking time for hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leitch. Today, we are lucky enough to what I call have a moderator and a keynote speaker on the program. Moderated today by Paul Stanford, and the keynote speaker is Todd McCormick. And Todd, I tell you, I want to thank you for being nice enough to take a few moments and join us here on the big broadcast.
It's my pleasure, Casper. Thank you for spending so much time on such an important subject.
And Paul, I want to thank you for being nice enough to also every Thursday be part of our family here on the big broadcast.
You're welcome, Casper. Thank you.
And today's topic we're kicking off is the evolution of cannabis in Europe and the cultural impact that it's had. And Todd, you and Paul both have a tremendous amount of input on that topic, and I thought we might open up with you.
Well, Paul and I have both been studying hemp for a very long time. We were both fortunate enough to be very close to Jack Herer and work on his seminal book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, with him. And when researching that book, it became really obvious to me that when you think back to, say, Columbus's time, when he discovered the New World, this was 300 years before the invention of the cotton gin. This was almost 400 years before the invention of the synthetic, like nylon, that we would go on to replace the cotton with. And when you think back to where Columbus was in 1492, much of his ship and much of everything around him, the clothing he wore, the paper he used, the ropes, the riggings, the paints, the varnishes, only came from the cannabis plant. And when you think about that, the cultural evolution of Europe is and was greatly dependent on their application of cannabis industrially. And I was asked a question yesterday, what I thought was the biggest, basically, and best breakthrough for cannabis. And I had to say it was cannabis sativa L, because when the Indo-Europeans and the Asians started using cannabis as a textile, that's when human evolution really took off. You think, Paul?
Yeah. Yeah, I of course agree. You go back to prehistoric civilizations in Central Asia, and you see that cannabis is cultivated thousands of years prior to the written word. And then you look at the first text in China, in present-day India, and they both talked about hemp as being the most important crop. So it goes back, as we know, at least 12,000 years, and maybe more than 25,000 years that cannabis has been cultivated by human beings. And, you know, you can just look at a wolf and then look at a Chihuahua or a Rottweiler and know that we've changed that species a great deal over the past 7,000 years. So cannabis and humans have co-evolved just like that, each to meet each other's needs. And so our nutritional requirements perfectly match the amino acid profile and the essential fatty acid profile of hemp seed. And of course, cannabis flowers have THC and other chemicals that mimic brain and nervous system neurotransmitters. So we've co-evolved for a long time, perhaps longer than any other two species. So we have this symbiotic relationship that continues to this day. And it's a shame that, you know, certain economic forces, starting about 100 years ago, started to spread a lot of misinformation about it. You know, I have a large collection of cannabis antique medical marijuana containers. And what amazes me is that a lot of them, starting about 100 years ago, were marked poison. So I just wonder why, you know, and cannabis has no lethal dose. You can take as much as you can possibly take and you're not going to die. So I just wonder why it was labeled poison 100 years ago. What do you think, Todd?
Well, I think that in the way that they use the term might be a little bit different from the way we use the term now, whereas in a sense poison was more of a toxin, and they would put it on things that were just anything that could hurt your skin, hurt your in any way. You know, now I think of it at the highest degree of the definition of the word, like, you know, you're going to kill somebody, but I think it was more like of something that could toxify or if you used in a concentrated manner, you know, something you should be concerned about. You know, when we launched the museum in Barcelona, for those people listening, there is a new Barcelona museum that is dedicated to cannabis culture and hemp history. And when we launched that, Ben Dronkers, the gentleman at the museum, has a vast collection of medicinal bottles. And when you look back, I think that their use of the word poison was almost like a disclaimer, like their way of the little legal fine print. It's like, oh yeah, and by the way, there's the list of things that could happen. And I, like you, Paul, don't really see the toxicity of cannabis really make sense per se why they would put poison on something that's not poisonous. But I think it could have just been the companies back in the time trying to cover themselves. You know, it's interesting in the news today. There's the news literally today is that hemp is used in over 25,000 products now, including the new BMW, the electric BMW that is getting all the news today and yesterday, has hemp in it, as does actually all the BMWs, Jaguars, Mercedes, even the Bugatti has hemp in it grown in northern Holland by the same gentleman, Ben Dronkers, that owns the hemp and marijuana museums located in both Barcelona and Amsterdam. And it's pretty amazing how he has been able to get hemp back into the commodities around him in Europe, because when the companies are looking for environmental alternatives to some of the products that they're already consuming, they are compelled under European environmental law to use products like hemp. And it's great to see these companies starting to embrace it. So now all of the more expensive lines of Mercedes and BMW, the 7 Series, the 5 Series, all the S Series, SLs have hemp in them. And it's an amazing what when you look at it, 20 years ago, none of those companies were using hemp. And I've been pressuring Ben to say, this is what has to happen in North America, because the farmers in America are being ripped off. 100 years ago, special interests came in after World War II and reorganized the way that the government did business. Everybody listening should take the time to watch a wonderful documentary called Why We Fight, because after World War II, the armament division of the military-industrial complex went crazy and basically took over our government. They waged wars all over the world, and they reorganized the way we were allowed as consumers to basically live. Because farmers, when you think about this, who had for generations since the moving of westward from the people that came here originally, as we went west, we planted hemp. All of our covered wagons were made out of canvas. When you have canvas, it was from cannabis, so all of this wild hemp growing in places like Nebraska is from the settlers. And when you look at the fact that now these same farmers are not even allowed to process the hemp growing on their property, it's a little ridiculous, because what happened is all of these big businesses after World War II came up with the synthetic solutions to hemp, helped to keep hemp outlawed, and have kept farmers basically in a stranglehold.
I often say that, marijuana prohibition is really about fuel, fiber, money, power, and the continued centralization of economic and political control. They just made up this whole marijuana myth to, have the economic markets concentrate on petrochemical alternatives and synthetic alternatives and things that are capital intensive. So most of us can't play that game. It takes tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to drill for petroleum. It takes tens of billions of dollars to process it into fuel and other products. But you can get 300 gallons of diesel fuel from an acre of hemp with the residual 30 tons of fiber and 3 tons of food. And you just take that hemp seed oil, pour it right into your diesel engine, turn the key, and you can drive around.
Back in 1916, the USDA put out Bulletin 404, which Paul is very familiar with. And what they try to emphasize is that in order to get the same amount of paper out of trees, the same amount of paper that would grow in 1 acre of hemp in 1 year's time would take 4 years of Douglas fir trees growing perpetually for 20 years to make the same amount of paper that farmers could get off of 1 acre of hemp grown in under a year. And this is when you start looking at the economic viability of hemp, you can see why I say, and Paul says, that in a sense, farmers are being ripped off right now. I mean, I love Willie Nelson. He's been a big advocate for the cause. But those guys can have as many farm aids as they want. But until they realize that it's about hemp, that those farms were built on hemp, and they weren't built on, cotton. I mean, cotton didn't come along for 300 years after we started settling this country. There wasn't a patent on a cotton gin until the 1790s. Yet slavery started in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, along with the passing of laws that said that farmers had to grow at least 10% of their land as hemp. Because what a lot of your listeners might not realize is that when Columbus arrived in this country, what he found was tobacco. What he expected to find and couldn't find was growing all over Europe and was cannabis hemp. And without it, he couldn't mend his sails, he couldn't mend his ropes, he couldn't repaint his boat, he couldn't get home. So sailors back 300-400 years ago had to set sail with barrels full of hemp seeds, because if they happened to crash somewhere that didn't have hemp, that was their main ingredient. That was their source material that they would be able to grow, be able to process, and fix their ships with. Without it, they were shipped out of luck, is basically what they were. And when these people landed in North America, what they immediately started doing was trying to plant hemp so that they could get independent of Europe. Because without hemp, we had to take all of our drug money, which was our tobacco money. We had to buy all of our blankets and our beddings and our everything cloth, everything paper, all of the ship sails, all of the ropes. We had to buy it back from Europe, which kept our country broke. So why our forefathers demanded that we grow hemp is so that we could keep that economy here. So we need it now in the 21st century as much as we needed it back in the 14, 15, 1600s.
Yeah, it's really a matter of social and economic justice because, we don't need to give all of our money to the petrochemical companies. We can give it to our farmers instead of petrochemical companies stashing it away in their Swiss bank accounts or investing in tar sands in Saskatchewan or molybdenum. Huh?
I would like to point this out. Anybody can go online and look at photographs of Dubai 20 years ago. It was a desert, okay? You go back to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, before, the pot of oil and Bush 1 started drilling there, and it was a desert. And all of the money that we have put into the petrochemical industry could have been spread out all over North America had one simple decision been made, and that was to allow the patent from Rudolph Diesel, which developed the diesel engine to run on vegetable-based oils. His concept with the diesel engine was to fit it into the ecosystem. He believed that he could create a machine that would run off of the vegetable oils created by the plants that grew from the soil it plowed. So it fit right in. But when we started fueling our machines with these dead dinosaurs, the Saudis got rich, the Saudi Arabia got rich, Dubai grew like a weed, but our farmers went broke. And the reality is this isn't an accident. This was corporate manipulation with our capitalistic economy, allowing our farmers to go broke. Because realistically, I think the government's enjoying taking their land. I think the government didn't like homesteading in some ways, and now they're going back there. They've created an economy that the farmers cannot compete in. And now when they can't pay their taxes, and they're not the ones getting rich like the guys in Dubai with the little cap on the oil well, well, they're losing their land back to the government, who's then selling it to mega corporations and parceling it out. And I think it's a manipulation of again, the capitalist system. The same government that said, go west and multiply, and you can build a fence, you can keep the land, is now coming in and saying, sorry, we're going to create an economic situation you can't compete in, and if you don't like that, too bad, we want the land back. And I think American farmers should really start looking at this more realistically and being angry, because, like I keep saying, Hemp Aid can be up there on stage with all the celebrity endorsements they want, but until they start telling the truth, until they start focusing on the fact that these farms were not built on the commodities they're allowed to grow right now, that they were built on the canvas-covered wagons that went west, they were built on the rope walks of Boston, they were built on the sail manufacturing that went on everywhere, all around the country as we try to build our nation. That's what these farms were really built on. And realistically, this is what we need now. We need to be independent of these oil sources from Saudi Arabia. I'm really glad you're spending this time, because I really think that a lot of people, especially the people that use cannabis, don't really get the significance of what the hemp history really means. I mean, I believe, as Paul does when he made the joke about what prohibition is really about, is about the lucrative industrial industry, making sure that there's no competition for them. The cannabis prohibition or marijuana prohibition has never really been about marijuana. I really think that it was more just a racial trigger, a racial lever they could use to take it away from people that would never have allowed them to prohibit hemp or cannabis. And anybody listening to this should really take a few minutes, if they're into the history, and go back and read the transcripts from the House and Ways Committee before they actually passed what ended up being the Marijuana Tax Act, because they took 4 days of testimony. And for 3 days, they listened to a bunch of farmers and paint manufacturers and people that did not know that marijuana was this old English word hemp or cannabis, because the government had specifically used the term, like I would say it like this. Back in the 30s, if I had walked up to anybody listening to this and said, hey, they're going to make a plant called Awesome illegal, you would have looked at me and said, I've never heard of a plant called Awesome or marijuana. And if you had went and looked it up in every pharmacopoeia ever written or every encyclopedia up to that time, you would not find a plant called Awesome, as did none of the farmers find a plant called marijuana. And with that said, the government was able to then usher in legislation under the nose of so many people that didn't realize what it was. And the director, the legislative council of the American Medical Association, he went so far as to write Congress and berate them, saying that what you're doing is going to serve no good purpose whatsoever, and how far it may prove to deny people the benefits of a medicine that is yet foreseen is impossible to tell. And that was a very poignant remark, because it ended up becoming the truth because the government prohibited what they didn't even understand at the time. When the government stepped up and prohibited what they were calling marijuana, they didn't even know what THC was. They thought that what got us high was something was called at the time the Adams 9 compound. And they didn't even know what THC was. They didn't know how safe it was. They didn't know how effective it was medicinally. They just basically listened to the social, the economic influence of these big companies and passed these laws that were not good for the people in society, but were great for big business. And marijuana laws have never been about protecting society from marijuana. Governments will let you drink till you have cirrhosis. They'll let you smoke cigarettes until you have black lung. They don't care about you. But what they care about is the economic feasibility of the people that put them in power and put them in office. There's just more crony capitalism is what we're looking at.
Well, of course, I completely agree with that. You know, there's this false dichotomy that we have. We believe that hemp and marijuana are different plants. And the fact of the matter is, they are the same plant. They're cannabis sativa. And most of the strains that I grow in my Oregon licensed medical marijuana garden are mixes of indica and sativa variety. But, what they've done is they've prohibited the plant, where they allow the low THC hemp up in Canada and Europe. While, I'm sure it's good for the car auto bodies, and we do get some nice hemp foods finally for the first time in several generations that are on the shelves at the health food store. What they've done is they've bred these plants that have virtually no THC, less than 0.3% THC. And the way they've done that is they have bred out the flowers. And by breeding out the flowers, they've bred out the THC, but also the seeds. And it's the seed that we really need. It's really about hemp seed oil and its competition with petrochemical alternatives. If we could get hemp seed oil from high THC plants that have lots of flowers and big buds, then it'd be 20 times more productive than these low THC dwarf hemp plants that they allow in Canada and Europe. The dichotomy that they've convinced us of, that these are different plants, is false. They're really the same plant. Hemp, cannabis, marijuana, they all come from the same plant. And when we remove these artificial regulations that create this economic barrier to the full utilization of hemp fuel and fiber, then we'll see a complete reversal of this economic pyramid where the money will flow to the people instead of to a few people at the top.
Well, I'd like to interject something. I had the great privilege of pre-reading a book that I urge everybody to go out and buy. It's called Cannabis Evolution and Ethnobotany by Robert C. Clark and Mark Merlin. Robert Clark brought you the two books, Marijuana Botany and Hashish. And it's an interesting thing, though. One of the main points they make, Mark and Rob makes in the book, which is going to shake up the marijuana world, is that nobody smokes sativa. I'll say it again. Nobody smokes sativa. What we're referring to when we call plant sativa is really equatorial drug varieties. When you think about cannabis history in the 50s and 60s, a lot of what we were smoking was coming in was from Vietnam, Thailand, Colombia, Acapulco Gold, Michoacan, Jamaican, Maui Wowie. All of this stuff we would now call sativa. None of it is. What it really is an equatorial drug variety, because if you were to go to India, and if you look at the word indica on face value, it means of or like India. And back in the day, let's say Columbus's day, if I walked up to Paul and I handed him some seeds, he would have two questions for me. One question would be sativa, which meant, is it the cannabis sativa, which is a Latin suffix, which basically means so widely or most useful? Or is it indica, he would ask me, because that means, is it of or like India? Because even back in the day, Columbus was trying to get to India because he wanted a quicker path to the spices. Cannabis was no question one of the highly most traded spices. And indica grown near Goa which is a very tropical southern tip of India, is very much indica. But it looks like and smokes like, it smells like what we call sativa, because what it really is a tropical southern variety of plants found in India that were cultivated and bred for drug variety. Now, as you get into northern India and places like the Himalayas, you get a dual-use plant. You get plants that, to this day, are turned into hashish, but then are also turned into the clothing and the fabrics and to some of the things that the necessities that are used by the locals in an industrial way. And, the metaphor Paul was making earlier about Dobermans and Chihuahuas, I made years ago on Politically Incorrect, because I was being berated about marijuana use and hemp and medical, and I said, look, we all have seen dogs. Okay, we know what a dog is. Cannabis is like a dog. There's a big difference between a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, and still a dog. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about cannabis hemp. There are so many different varieties of cannabis, actually, that do have low THC for sure. But there are other varieties that have higher THC and have still been used traditionally as a dual-use industrial and drug plant in the Hindu Kush Mountains, in places like Nepal, Himalaya, all through India, and such. And it's going to be, I think, hard for people that are used to the word sativa to get away from it. But literally what people meant when they said sativa in Europe was the Indo-European hemp variety. The question, what sativa was, is can I turn it into rope? Can I turn it into paints and varnishes? Can I turn it into fabrics and paper and things I need every day? Or is it indica? Is it going to get me high? Humans have taken cannabis everywhere all over the world. And when you look at the natural path that cannabis has taken, humans have been the one taking it with them. I was in a conversation with Maxine, and I was asking the Congresswoman basically when the Congress was going to give hemp back to the American farmers. And she looked at me rather perplexed when I said, give it back. And I said, yeah, re-legalize. And she said, re-legalize? I said, Maxine, I ask you this. You allow, as a congresswoman, the DEA to run around and destroy hemp because it's not indigenous to the North American continent. So my question to you is, where did it come from? And sadly, she, a 25-year congresswoman with very much a college degree, couldn't answer that simple question. And I actually was blown away at that and said, Maxine, rumor has it you're black. You should know a thing or two about your history. And realistically, don't you know that the same laws on slavery were started at the same time with mandatory cultivation laws of cannabis? And her jaw dropped. And this is the problem I have, is that if people that are sitting in Congress that are elected representatives who are voting on these laws are so ignorant of their own history that they're allowing corporations to sway their decisions without even looking into the past, without even actually doing the due diligence in their homework, we as society are really screwed. And we have to stand up and start demanding more from these people because, I let her know that while I've been a fan of much of her liberal, we'll say, policies, I was disgusted at the idea that she did not know her own history. It really was. And this is more common than it is uncommon. And it's up to us to change that by teaching people what we've learned.
A while ago you mentioned when they made marijuana illegal and how, I believe it was Dr. Woodward who represented the AMA. He went into committee and said, you can't make this marijuana illegal. It's cannabis. Cannabis has a lot of medical uses. Of course, the heads of that committee went to the floor of Congress and lied and said the American Medical Association supported marijuana prohibition back in 1937. But if you look at the transcript, the Speaker of the House then, as he was for over 30 years, was Sam Rayburn of Bonham, Texas. Sam Rayburn grew hemp back on his farm in Bonham, Texas. So he introduced and said, this is a bill about something called marijuana. So he didn't even know he was prohibiting a crop that he grew back home. But that was the whole purpose of renaming it marijuana, because nobody knew what that was. Again, it's all about money and power. And we've got to re-educate people about the history of cannabis. And I know you were talking about Ben Dronkers and the hemp and Cannabis Museum in Barcelona and Amsterdam. I think Casper mentioned something like there's a marijuana leaf on a statue in Barcelona.
Yeah,
you know about that?
Yes. If you go to Barcelona at the end of the Rambla, there is a statue that's very high with Columbus standing at the top of it pointing to the New World. And very suspiciously, or not, depending on how you look at it, we adorn statues with plants all the time. But it looks like, you'll love this, Paul, hemp stalk going up the side of the statue, and at the top of the hemp stalk looks like a big 7-pointed hemp leaf. And anybody listening to this can go right on Google and search for high-resolution images of the statue of Columbus in Barcelona and see for yourself, and you tell me what you think those patterns of plant leaves look when you consider what plant was responsible for so much of that ship. And, Ben Dronkers is a wonderful man that purchased the first hemp museum in the 80s from Ed Rosenthal and another gentleman and renovated it into a world-class facility, expanded it in the 90s when his interest in environmental hemp grew, and created the Hemp Gallery down the street. So it's 2 museums. And then went even further in the 90s and purchased a 500-year-old former palace of the Spanish Revolutionary Guard. When France was occupying Spain, this palace was used by the revolutionary freedom fighters for Spain. And it's really an amazing place of history when you think of the struggles that we're going through and, the occupation we're all dealing with the government's intrusion in our lives. When we can't grow flowers, it's just amazing. I mean, people listening might not know it, but I served 5 years in federal prison because after California changed their law, I became one of the first people they arrested for growing medical marijuana. And it astounded me that, they will lock up somebody that has no criminal record and grew flowers with people that murder and create mayhem and the worst, and think it's okay. And when they treat us like we're criminals for simply really growing flowers and being a farmer, the worst assault on our liberty that's possible. When you listen to people in America talking about, losing their gun rights, it's silly because they've already lost their right to grow a flower. And honestly, if you were ever going to stand up for the sake of anything's liberty, it would have to be for the sake of a flower to grow, because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about hemp farming and we're talking about medical marijuana and cannabis use as adults. It's really just about growing flowers and not being afraid to grow the seeds that the earth has given you in light of the government holding a gun to your head and saying, be afraid of me, be very afraid of me.
Well, I have a resistance, and it's a resistance to the clock, but no matter how hard I try to resist it, I can't fight the fact that it keeps right on ticking. So, gentlemen, I want to say thank you for being part of our broadcast. And as we say here, time for hemp is like a good joint. It's always best when you share it with your friends.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look and spend some time for him. Don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yes, it's time for him. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 bales of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, time for help! Yeah!
How would you like to have all the best cannabis info all in one place? Canafo.com is the Google, Facebook, and Craigslist of cannabis. It even has its own social media platform. Canafo.com puts the world of medicinal and recreational cannabis in one place for consumers, businesses, and growers. Canafo.com is a free service where you can find over 9,000 different strains of cannabis, shop cannabis classifieds, and much more. Canafo.com is the world's most comprehensive source for all things cannabis. Get in the know with Canafo.